All right, so Florio, though, look at this game. Had a lot of performances go big. Matthew Stafford, a huge night. Puka, an absolute blow-up night. If you ran into one or maybe both of those guys, give us some names of people you can put in, take some big swings just to try to close the gap a little bit.
Yeah, we were talking about this morning, and one of our producers, Alan Flowers, he is down 100 points this morning because he ran into a Puka and Stafford stack. Well, you have to shoot for upside, and Quentin Johnson, I know the floor is very low, but he's getting the Cowboys this week. He could, if things hit, get you 20-plus fantasy points. DJ Moore, he is someone that you're probably already considering given that the Bears' other receivers are out, but he now has a very high ceiling. Aaron Jones, Jordan Mason, and Jordan Addison against the Giants. I think Aaron Jones is just a straight play this week. I know some of these other floors are low, but if you're down 45-plus fantasy points from one or two guys, I think you need to try to chase upside now because your season's on the line.
Hitting singles and doubles works in the regular season, not at this point in your fantasy season. By the way, you mentioned DJ Moore. The Bears, a lot going on there in Chicago. Let's take a look.
Now you guys were pretty fast to get back in the locker room after that game, though. With that being said now, that's 10, gentlemen. That's 10. Bring it on in. Bring it on in. Bring it on in. Good, better, bad. Good, better, bad. Never let it rest. Never let it rest. You good gets better. You good gets better. You better get better. You better get better. Bears on 3. 1, 2, 3. Bears.
I know that the sun was not out in Chicago because Ben Johnson did not have the guns out in Chicago. Big one, though, as we get into the Saturday games, because Saturday football is back. We start with the Packers and the Bears in rank. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you are promoting a Bear player in this one.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at Colston Loveland, who's really stepped up over the last couple of weeks. He's had at least 5 targets in 4 consecutive games. And you know what? He doesn't drop the ball. His lone drop over the last couple of weeks was not really a drop. It was an overturned. I don't know how it was conclusive to anybody out there, but still has become one of the most reliable guys. And seeing him up close and in person on Sunday, it really is impressive what he's able to do out there on the field. And for anybody who's going to play a DFS slate on Saturday, Janae Walker is a name to keep an eye on. What we've seen out of the Bears over the last couple of weeks is that they find players that you might not have heard of who start stepping up. And so when Janae Walker goes out there and scores a touchdown this week, do not be shocked.
Yeah, we just saw a divisional game last night that was much more higher scoring than the first. That could be the case tomorrow. And I think you start Jordan Love in this one because Love has been in the start-sit article a lot this year. He's very predictable based on the matchup because he's super touchdown dependent. He doesn't throw for a lot of yards each week. He doesn't really run. But not only have the Bears allowed the 5th most passing touchdowns to quarterbacks, what I really like about this matchup is they play man and blitz at a high rate. They've done so all year, but in the last 4 or 5 weeks, it has reached new levels, especially with how aggressive they are blitzing the quarterback. Love is first in EPA against both man coverage and when he is blitzed. So I just think this is a good matchup for Jordan Love to stay hot.
Should be a really interesting quarterback matchup between these two teams, too. Very interested in checking this one out. The other game we have on Saturday, the Eagles heading to Washington to take on the Commanders. And Florio, should we be scared of Scary Terry?
I love Scary Terry. He helped me win in a league last week, but I think you could beware of him in this one. Look, that 14-target game a couple weeks ago with Mariota was nice, but in the 2 games since, he has just a combined 10 targets. And Mariota this year, as good as he has been floor-wise for fantasy and himself, his own fantasy value, he is just 1 game with more than 213 passing yards, and he's thrown multiple passing touchdowns just twice. So the pass catcher's upside is limited there, and then you factor in the Eagles in the last month, 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers and just 1 touchdown. He's not a must-sit, but I'm sitting him in a league for Mike Evans and Jawan Jennings. So if you're in a situation like that, I think you could get away from Terry McLaurin.
I know it's been a little bit frustrating having Devonta Smith on your roster the last few weeks because the production hasn't been there. The opportunity has absolutely been there for him, though. 29 targets over his last 4 games. It just hasn't really turned into a lot of yards or fantasy points while A.J. Brown is continuing to eat. I think that changes this week, partially just because of the matchup. Washington has generally been ungood. They are even ungooder against wide receivers lined up in the slot, which is where Devonta Smith does a lot of his work. I think at this point you are starting whatever Eagles you have. Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, but Devonta Smith in a really good position to have a good week for your fantasy team this week. Really big, really interesting matchup in the AFC between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Denver Broncos, two of the hottest teams in the AFC at this point. And even though Travis Etienne has been playing really well for Jacksonville, I'm going to tell you to beware of him. I mean, what you do like is the opportunity. Averaging 19 touches per game since week 9. That number might even go up a little bit now that Bashaw Tutin is out of action. He's got 9 total touchdowns since week 10, but flat out, Denver has been the worst matchup all season long for running backs. It doesn't matter if you're running it or if you're catching it. The Broncos not giving up a whole lot of yards. They're not giving up a whole lot of touchdowns to the position. This, I think, could be kind of a slugfest. A lot of defensive plays on this one, maybe not a lot of points. So Travis Etienne, I get it. You might be in a position where you have to start him, but it's not one that I'm very excited about.
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions about him and a lot of questions about R.J. Harvey this week, and I get the matchup is really tough. The Jags' run defense is one of the best in football. I still think you start Harvey because he's just been dominating volume. 17 or more carries in the last 2. He's been featured heavily in the passing game as of late, outside of last week where they didn't really have to throw a whole bunch. And then the goal line usage, right? 4 touchdowns in his last 4 games. I still think even despite this matchup, he is in play as an RB2 or flex play this week.
It gets us to another AFC West matchup. The Chargers, actually not fully AFC West, but the Chargers heading down to Dallas to take on the Cowboys. Rank, I know you have been really big on the Chargers passing game in this one.
Yeah, I love the matchup, which is why I'm going to be starting Ladd McConkey this week against the Cowboys. Obviously, Ladd leads the Chargers with 715 receiving yards this year. He's got a great matchup here. The Cowboys have allowed the most fantasy points per game to wideouts this season. They've allowed 24 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers, 4 more than any other team in the league. And one of the other players, again, I was mentioning some of the DFS plays you might want to look at. Trey Harris is a really interesting option for you in the DFS slate. We talked about this yesterday in Stacks on Stacks. Triple stacking the Chargers this week with Ladd McConkey, Harris, and of course, Justin Herbert.
On the other side, George Pickens in a little bit of a slump. He's been so good all year long, but the last 2 weeks have not been particularly great. And on paper, this is not a good matchup for Pickens or the Cowboys receivers in general. The Chargers have been very tough in their secondary, but this is just sort of believing and trusting in a guy who's been great for you all season long. A guy who's been a top 5 receiver for much of the season. He's been averaging over 18 fantasy points per game on a team that still is throwing the ball at one of the higher rates of any team in the NFL. So it's sort of just believing in Dak. It's believing in CeeDee Lamb, and it's believing in George Pickens to come up with a good number despite the odds here in a game that I do think could be a back-and-forth contest with a lot of points scored. So I think there's some opportunities for George Pickens to make some plays in this one. Coming up, J.J. McCarthy and Jackson Dart face off Sunday in the Big Apple. But which of these rising stars should be in your fantasy lineup on Sunday? We got that answer and more when we continue. DK Metcalf showing us that sometimes bullying does work, as he got into the end zone of that one on Monday night. Big interconference matchup between the Steelers and the Lions. Maybe Aaron Rodgers' final trip ever to Detroit. But the guy I'm looking at is Jaylen Warren, mostly as a cautionary tale for fantasy managers. I think you should beware of starting the Steelers running back in this one. First off, it's just a bad matchup against the Lions. They've been the second worst matchup for running backs all season long. The worst news, though, is the rise of Kenneth Gainwell in the Pittsburgh backfield. He's already dominating the backfield targets. Now he's starting to close the gap when it comes to his share of the rushing attempts as well. This has the potential to be a high-scoring contest, which means we might see Aaron Rodgers throwing the football more, a situation where more pass attempts, more targets. That tends to favor Gainwell a little bit more over Jaylen Warren. So if you can get away from him, I would suggest that for this week.
Speaking of targets, Jamison Williams has flourished since Dan Campbell took over the play calling in Week 10. That's why he's a start for me this week. He has been the wide receiver 5 since going back to Week 8, but he's had at least 9 targets in 3 consecutive games, and the Steelers have allowed the 3rd most receptions to wide receivers this season, Marcus.
Let's get down to a big matchup in the NFC South, the Buccaneers and the Panthers. And Florio, Bryce Young's been a little bit of a riddle wrapped inside of enigma this week, or this year, I should say. What do you think about him this week?
Look, us short kings got to stick together. And Bryce, I'm supporting you. I need you to support my fantasy teams because you are my Patrick Mahomes replacement this week. But look, I like Bryce because he has been running more in the last 3 weeks. That has elevated his fantasy floor. But this is about the matchup for me. The Bucs have struggled against the pass all year, but since week 10, they are top 3 in passing yards and touchdowns, and every quarterback to face them in that span has topped 18 fantasy points, including Tyler Shuck and Kirk Cousins the last 2. And if you believe in this kind of thing, Bryce Young faced them twice last year and went for multiple touchdowns in each game.
On the other side, I think you have to worry about all of the Buccaneers receivers not named Mike Evans. If there's a thing we saw from Evans' return, it was the reminder that when Baker Mayfield gets in trouble, he's just going to throw it in the direction of number 13. Baker had an 11.5 air yards per attempt in that game, just the second time he's been in double digits in that category. But 50% of those air yards went to Mike Evans. Everybody else is fighting for short yardage targets, trying to live on yards after the catch. And now you got an additional mouth to feed because on top of Evans coming back, Jalen McMillan is also back. So now you got 4 wide receivers. You've got Bucky Irving. You've got a tight end all battling for targets. At this point, Mike Evans is the only guy in that group that I have any real amount of faith in on a consistent basis. You mentioned Patrick Mahomes. We know he is gone, unfortunately, for the rest of the season. The Chiefs heading to Tennessee to take on the Titans. And I'm telling you, you can have a little bit of faith in the stash. Gardner Minshew this week, I think, is going to be an interesting proposition. I'm telling you this more probably in a DFS context. I'm not going to tell you to start him with your fantasy championship potentially on the line here. But it's mostly because we've seen so many backup quarterbacks go out there this year and just play loose, just kind of play carefree with nothing to lose. That absolutely describes Gardner Minshew. Even when he was a starter, a frontline starter for like the Jaguars, he kind of played that way. On top of it, just a great matchup against a Titans defense that has been bad all year long, especially against the pass. Last few weeks, going back to week 8, it's been 18 touchdown passes, 2 interceptions for this Titans defense. So Minshew, kind of a sneaky, maybe outside the box DFS play for you this week.
Yeah, the Titans defense has been bad, which means like the running backs probably don't get a lot of opportunity. But that has not been the case for Tony Pollard, who I am starting this week. He's had at least 18 fantasy points in back-to-back games, topping over 265 rushing yards in those fixtures. He has 3 rushing touchdowns in his last 2. He has the highest percent, or the 4th highest percentage of rushing attempts for his team, which is the 4th highest in the NFL, Marcus.
Thanks, Frank. We got an interesting one between the Vikings and the Giants. A couple of young quarterbacks going on in that one. And you've been all on the Dart side, so I'm assuming you are big on Jackson Dart against the Vikings.
Yeah, we were talking about the Ted Lasso Dart episode just before the show, and each week pretty much Jackson Dart has been barbecue sauce. Not so much this week. It pains me to say it. I think this is a week you should try to get Jackson Dart out of your starting lineups because of the matchup against the Vikings. They've allowed the 5th fewest yards and 3rd fewest touchdown passes this season. And I checked this stat like 4 times because I just didn't believe it. They've allowed 1 touchdown pass since week 10. We're in week 16 now. So for me, I'm sitting him for Jacoby Brissett in a league. I think that's pretty straightforward. I would also play Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, Jordan Love, and Bo Nix over him. So a lot of situations where you can get away from Jackson Dart because of the matchup.
You know, I wish people would have been a little bit more curious and not judgmental when it comes to J.J. McCarthy, who's had at least 20 fantasy points in back-to-back games. Now he's got a great matchup against the Giants, who've allowed 4 rushing touchdowns to quarterbacks this season. That's tied for the 5th most in the NFL, which is an underrated part of J.J. McCarthy's game, although he's probably not going to be allowed to gritty into the end zone. Although I would have just blamed that on 9. Like, listen, that wasn't me, coach. That was 9. 9 was grittying. You should go find him. But the Giants have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. So I do believe, like, there's people in situations where you lost Jaden Daniels this year. You've lost guys like Patrick Mahomes. J.J. McCarthy is a viable option for you if you are looking for a quarterback to spot start this week.
And he's decided to be like a goldfish, which I think has helped him persevere as the season has gone along. So, interesting one there. Let's dive in now to our Next Gen Nugget with our researcher, Kendall Mursky, a.k.a. Next Gen Ken. And, Kendall, you heard Florio and Rank talk about the quarterbacks in this Vikings-Giants matchup, but you are looking at the running backs in this one.
Yeah, I want to focus in the backfield this week because the Giants have been one of the most generous defenses to the running back position this season. In fact, The 5.9 yards per rush that they've allowed to running backs is the second most by any team since 1950. And you can see their struggles illustrated here, ranking last in yards over expected per rush, yards before contact per rush, explosive rush rate. But the yards after contact and the missed tackle rate really plays into the strengths of Jordan Mason, as he has the third highest missed tackle force rate among running backs this season. And for Aaron Jones, he still should have a fair share of opportunities on the ground, but he's caught at least 3 passes in 5 of his last 6 games. And on the other side, the Giants have allowed the 8th most receiving yards per game to running backs since Week 8. Now, I know a lot of people have been staying away from Jordan Mason in games that Aaron Jones is active. They've only had 1 game this season with both of them scoring at least 10 fantasy points. But this is such a good matchup. I really think this is one of those weeks where with both of them active, they can actually both be viable flex options for you going into your fantasy semifinals.
I absolutely love that. I love Aaron Jones this week. I don't think volume's going to be an issue like it has been in some games in the past. Appreciate that, Kindle. Now, coming up for us on NFL Fantasy Live, there should be fantasy fireworks aplenty with Drake May and Lamar Jackson squaring off on Sunday night. But which one of these signal callers will find pay dirt first this weekend? That surprise answer and more when we return. Time to catch up on some news. If you know, you know. We'll turn our attention down to Duval, where the Jaguars have signed wide receiver Jacoby Myers to a 3-year, $60 million extension. That includes $40 million guaranteed. Myers has solidified himself as a legitimate fantasy asset during his time in Jacksonville, where he scored double-digit fantasy points for 5 consecutive weeks. So, Rank, let's kind of take a forward look at this, right? Now they've got Jacoby Myers locked in. They still have Brian Thomas, Travis Hunter, who unfortunately was injured midway through the season. But you've got 3 guys down there. If you're a fantasy manager looking at the Jags for next year, what should you expect?
Well, I think that Brian Thomas Jr. still got a big name, and people are going to be looking at him. The biggest question to me is what's going to happen with Travis Hunter. Now, obviously, people wanted to make this a thing this season. They were hoping he was going to go out there and be a two-way player. But now if I'm the Jags, and I've looked at how productive Jacoby Myers and Brian Thomas have been as a tandem, I look at Travis Hunter as more of a specialty package. Like, we'll run some plays for him, but start focusing him on the defensive side of the football. But again, this is going to be one of the most interesting things to keep a track of during the offseason is what Liam Cohen and this team does with Travis Hunter moving forward.
So before the season, someone called Travis Hunter Shohei Ohtani. I don't know who would do that.
That's craziness. I can't imagine who would say something like that. Anyway, back to the game previews. Bengals and Dolphins. Joe Burrow hopefully a little more gruntled. Meanwhile, Quinn Ewers getting the start for Miami. So are you still in or out now with Darren Waller?
I'm still in. I think Quinn Ewers playing adds a little bit of risk to Darren Waller because we don't know what that offense is going to look like. Is Waller going to see as much volume as he has with Tua? Are the Dolphins going to score the ball as much as they did with Tua? But I still think he is in play because of the matchup. He should still be the clear-cut go-to option when they're in the red and end zone. But the Bengals, they've allowed by far the most in every category. Catches, yards, touchdowns, fantasy points, 2 tight ends. But they've allowed 15 touchdowns. The Steelers are the only other team at 10 with double-digit touchdowns allowed to tight ends. So because of that, I do think Waller is in play still as a streaming option.
So the Bengals are terrible against tight ends. Here's the thing. The Dolphins are also pretty bad against tight ends, which is why I think you get some sleeper vibes out of Mike Gesicki. Now, this really is primarily about the matchup just because the usage has not been particularly good. Although it is worth paying attention to T. Higgins, who is still in the concussion protocol, and we wait final word on his status for the week. But Miami, the second best matchup for tight ends. Only the Bengals have given up more receptions and receiving yards to the position. Plus, Miami's been tough on wide receivers, so it could be that this is a nice option, a nice, safe, productive option for Joe Burrow to get the football to this year or this week, I should say. Again, it's been a rough year for Gesicki, but the matchup makes him an intriguing daily fantasy play in case you are so inclined for that. Time now to take a look at the Sunday night matchup between the New England Patriots and the Baltimore Ravens. And Rank, it's been kind of a topsy-turvy year for the Ravens tight ends. Do we believe in Mark Andrews this week?
You know, going into this earlier in the week, I had Mark Andrews listed as a beware. Unfortunately, I benched him for Colby Parkinson, which means he's going to score 80 points this week again. But so that's just the way that goes. He's had just 4+ fantasy points in one of his last 4 games. Even in a smash spot against the Cincinnati Bengals, he was unable to get it going. He's had less than he doesn't get a lot of yards. So for me, he's a touchdown dependent guy, which he will score touchdowns because I started him or sat him this week, Marcus.
Yeah, it's awful when it works that way. And I'm about to shock everyone when I tell you to start TreVeyon Henderson here. You see there, the wide RB3 since week 10. Henderson is one of 3 running backs in NFL history to have multiple games with multiple 50-yard touchdown runs in it. It's Saquon Barkley and Chris Johnson and TreVeyon Henderson, the only difference being Henderson is 14 games into his NFL career, and for half of them, his coach didn't want to put him on the field. But I know the Ravens are tough against the run, but I think there's just far too much upside with TreVeyon. We saw last week he took a run that should have been a negative rushing yard and turned it into a 65-yard touchdown. Plus, the Ravens' one kind of weakness against running backs is through the air, and we've seen TreVeyon more utilized as a receiver as of late.
Yeah, but we just kind of want Ramondre Stevenson to fade into the background and give TreVeyon some more opportunities. That would be nice. It's time now for Seize the Season, presented by Caesars Sportsbook. And according to Caesars Sportsbook, here are the most likely players to score the first touchdown during the Sunday night matchup between the Pats and the Ravens. You see Derrick Henry up top, followed by TreVeyon Henderson. Mark Andrews sliding in there at third, followed by Zay Flowers and Ramondre Stevenson. So, Florio, if you're picking somebody to score the first touchdown, you going here on menu or maybe off menu?
I know I was just talking up TreVeyon Henderson. Derrick Henry is always a great bet to score a touchdown, but I'm going to go off menu and tell you it's going to be one of the 2 quarterbacks here, because Drake May last week had 2 rushing touchdowns. They were the first 2 scores of that game. And then Lamar Jackson running near the goal line a little bit more, as you see there on the screen. So I'm going to have a little fun here, get some better odds and go deeper here. But both of these quarterbacks' legs, I think, are going to be big factors in this huge Sunday night matchup.
You got 2 mobile quarterbacks. Feels like an oversight not to have them on that list. But speaking of quarterbacks, Shedeur Sanders' stock may have slipped a bit in Week 15, but this week, Primetime's protege is looking to cash in on the Bills. Our game previews continue after the break. Stick around for more.
Welcome back to NFL Fantasy Live. Bills off a fresh and thrilling win on the road against the New England Patriots. We have my guy Josh Allen. We know to start him, but I like Dawson Knox as a sleeper. He's had at least 17 fantasy points in back-to-back games, and he's got a real advantageous matchup against the Browns, who've allowed the 5th most yards per game to tight ends this season. But, Michael, the Bills have not been great at stopping the run. What does that mean for Quinshon Judkins?
Yeah, I think Quinshon Judkins remains in play this week. We know he is the goal line back, and the Bills have allowed the most rushing touchdowns to running backs. But they've also allowed the 3rd most rushing yards and on top 3 in explosive run rate, both on the year and since week 11. So with Judkins, the one concern is getting game scripted out, but he has been used more in the passing game. Dylan Sampson up in the air. That helps him. I think Judkins is still very much so in play because of the matchup.
All right, Raiders, Texans. Dalton Schultz has been a stud this year. What are we doing with him against Las Vegas?
Yeah, I don't know what he has to do for people to trust him more, but I think Dalton Schultz has become just a guy you could start each week. He brings a very safe floor, but we've been getting more and more upside. Last week, a season-high 22 fantasy points, and since week 7, he is 5th amongst all tight ends in targets per game. And then on top of it, the Raiders, they've allowed 3 receiving touchdowns to tight ends since week 11. That is top 5, so I think you just ride the safe hand here in Dalton Schultz.
You know what? Brock Bowers has been a stud ever since he walked into the league, but I'm a little worrisome about him this week. Gunnar Helm, I'm not starting him. I'm not starting Gunnar Helm over him, but the Texans have allowed 2 top 10 tight ends since week 4. That was Trey McBride, George Kittle. Obviously, Brock Bowers would be in that category. One guy that you could possibly start over Brock Bowers, our guy Kyle Pitts. Monster game last week. Are we starting again this week, Michael?
Yeah, I think Kyle Pitts remains in play. I know they're saying that Drake London is going to likely be back this week, and that puts a little bit of a ding on Kyle Pitts' volume, but he had literally the best tight end performance of the season last week. He has scored 15 or more in each of his last 3 games, and he has been the top target every week for Kirk Cousins since he has taken over. And on top of that, the Cardinals have had their struggles against tight ends, so maybe the ceiling isn't quite as high with London out there, but the floor still feels pretty safe.
All right, New York Jets taking on the New Orleans Saints. A couple of weeks ago, I said to stash the Saints defense for this stretch run. Is that a good play, Michael?
Yeah, I think that was a great call on your part. The Saints defense is very much so in play this week because of who's on the other side. I know the Saints defense isn't one that we normally stream, but when you get this late in the season, you're chasing favorable matchups, and the Jets are exactly that. They have been top 3 in sack rate all season long. They are top 8 in fantasy points per game allowed to defenses, but it's only getting worse because with Brady Cook, the Jets have taken 9 sacks and yielded 5 giveaways in their last 2 games. That makes the Saints a very strong streaming option in the fantasy semifinals, which might have been crazy like 2 months ago to say, but with the Jets looking the way they are, it's very sound advice right now.
Yeah, that's one of the things about fantasy and looking ahead. Even if you missed out on the Saints, you might want to look at some of the other teams that have great matchups. There's only 4 teams left likely in your playoff race, so you're able to go out there and kind of work things out. I know it's all strategy, but sometimes they say it's better to be lucky than good. And here to talk about it is Marcus Grant with A Minute with Marcus.
Thank you, Adam. That's right. We've made it to the fantasy semifinals. It's the week before the week. Maybe take a moment to reflect on how you got here. Was it on the strength of some shrewd drafting and savvy roster moves? Or did you slide in when your opponent didn't get a Woody Marks touchdown they thought was theirs? By the way, fumble recovery should also still count as touchdowns. Or maybe you went from out of the playoffs entirely to a 3 seed and a second-round berth because of a Caleb Williams stat correction from 10 weeks ago. That and a favorable vote by your league mates. I mean, look, retconning the destruction of the Death Star is one thing. Retconning your fantasy season is quite another. But regardless, nobody makes it to this point in the fantasy season without a little bit of luck, and perhaps some in the form of statistical anomalies. Besides, you wouldn't have been in this position without some shrewd draft picks and some savvy roster moves. But as you prepare for your fantasy weekend, one thing to keep in mind is that it ain't over till it's over. And even then, it still might not be over. This has been another Minute with Marcus. Adam?